We've been chasing through the story of Stephen, and so today we're up to a speech he gave. It's a very long speech. He tells about 2,000 years of history, which I'm going to read every word of it just so that you've got a little bit of warning. So I want you to be paying attention. The theme of the speech itself is, are you paying attention? So we've got an attention test just to start off. So I'd like you paying attention, please. So here's a few questions. It's a little test about Italy because, you know, well, I've got an Italian ancestry and honeybees come from Italy and it's Italian. Italy's just a great place. So the first Italian question, which I've asked before, is where you need to be paying attention. Pineapple on pizza, yes or no? So I'm going to give you 5 seconds, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Put your hand up for yes. You're all wrong. Put your hand up for no. You're all right. This is a test on Italy, not on Australia. Question number 2. Question number 2, Ducati or Harley Davidson? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hands up for Ducati. Hands up for Harley. No, don't forget it because they're not Italian and so they don't count. So the Ducati people got it right. And they're probably not really a motorbike anyway, if truth be told. Question number 3, Ferrari or Lamborghini? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Think Ferrari. Ferrari? Come on. Is that all for Ferrari? Okay. Lamborghini? Okay. You win because they're both Italian and they're fantastic. So we've got one winner. I'm glad somebody has been paying attention. So let's go into the story of God's people as Stephen tells it in this long speech. Before we start, I want to talk a bit about what makes a story. Now, Stephen is telling a bit of history, but he's telling it as a story in a way, the story of God's people to the religious elders. One common way to split up a story is nice and simple, beginning, middle, and end. So here's how it works. Imagine that you've got a village, let's say a fantasy village, like a Lord of the Rings kind of village, and it's being attacked by a dragon. It kills people, burns the houses. One day it attacks, and there's a boy who's left standing in the street looking at where his home was and his family has died, and he realizes that it's up to him to chase down and destroy the dragon. So he leaves the village and sets off into the mountains. That's the beginning. We have the background, and there's a person who's been given a new task, a new identity, and he's no longer a villager. He's off on a quest with a new sense of purpose. And people look to him and they see the fire in his eyes and they know he's a new person. So we've got the beginning. Then happens in the middle part of the story. He's taken up with his travels. The author's job now is to set the task, which is defeat the dragon, but the author is also going to set up blocks so that he can't achieve it. And so the middle of the story is the journey of facing danger and conquering it and facing more and failing here and trying again. And the author sets up a whole lot of tension. That's what keeps us interested in a story. The ending of the story is signalled by another defining event. The character meets someone who gives him a new clue or a magic stone or a little crystal or some new wisdom. So there's that makes a difference. And armed with this new thing, the character is ready to face the dragon. And we know everyone lives happily ever after because make up your own story. You can do that. Stephen, the storyteller, gives us a bit of that classic form, the beginning, middle, and ending, as he tells this story of God's people to the religious leaders. He tells the story of 2,000 years of history of the times that the people paid attention. This is a story about paying attention. And the times they paid attention and the times they didn't pay attention to God. We meet Stephen when the early church is choosing people who would oversee the food distribution for widows and orphans. And last week, Dan Armstrong spoke of how Stephen was filled with the Holy Spirit and wisdom and full of grace and power. Stephen's ministry was strong, but there was opposition from the local synagogue community. They reported to the religious leaders that Stephen was saying things against Moses and against God, and Stephen was brought before the religious leaders for questioning. And here is his speech, the whole thing. So Stephen's been brought to the religious leaders, and the high priest asked Stephen, "Are these charges true?" To this he replied, "Brothers and fathers, listen to me. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham while he was still in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran. 'Leave your country and your people,' God said, 'and go to the land I will show you.' So he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. After the death of his father, God sent him to this land where you are now living. He gave him no inheritance here, not even enough ground to set his foot on. But God promised him that he and his descendants after him would possess the land, even though at that time Abraham had no child. God spoke to him in this way: 'For 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves,' God said, 'and afterward they will come out of that country and worship me in this place.' Then he gave Abraham the covenant of circumcision, and Abraham became the father of Isaac and circumcised him 8 days after his birth. Later, Isaac became the father of Jacob, and Jacob became the father of the 12 patriarchs." I'm going to stop for a minute and talk about what's happening here. It's a bit weird that we're going to cut off part of your, little boy's appendage as part of the people of God. We've got to forget what happens in circumcision these days as arguments about hygiene or health or culture or religion or social etiquette or anything. Back here, it was a matter of making, this is the community. This is how you'll be identified. This is a permanent sign which you cannot reverse and say, no, I was never a part of that. And it's part of what comes after it on this verse here. Abraham became the father of Isaac, circumcised him 8 days after his birth. Later, Isaac became the father of Jacob, and Jacob became the father of the 12 patriarchs. So the community is built around this physical sign of the flesh and this sign of being part of the patriarch, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And we see later on, we'll see Paul will talk about being a member of the tribe, a certain tribe of Israel. It's the identity. So what we have here is the beginning. This is the backstory in a way. And now we've got an identity of a community of people. Now I'll continue. Because the patriarchs were jealous of Joseph, they sold him as a slave in Egypt. But God was with him and rescued him from all his troubles. He gave Joseph wisdom and enabled him to gain the goodwill of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So Pharaoh made him ruler over Egypt and all his palace. Then a famine struck all Egypt and Canaan, bringing great suffering, and our ancestors could not find food. When Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent our forefathers on their first visit. On their second visit, Joseph told his brothers who he was, and Pharaoh learned about Joseph's family. After this, Joseph sent for his father Jacob and his whole family, 75 in all. Then Jacob went down to Egypt, where he and our ancestors died. Their bodies were brought back to Shechem and placed in the tomb that Abraham had brought from the sons of Hamor at Shechem for a certain sum of money. As the time drew near for God to fulfill his promise to Abraham, the number of our people in Egypt had greatly increased. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. He dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our ancestors by forcing them to throw out their newborn babies so that they would die. At that time, Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. For 3 months he was cared for by his family. Then he was placed outside. Pharaoh's daughter took him in and brought him up as her own son. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. When Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. The next day, Moses came upon 2 Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, "Men, You are brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other?" But the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" When Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons. After 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of a burning bush in the desert near Mount Sinai. When he saw this, he was amazed at the sight. As he went over to get a closer look, he heard the Lord say, "I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Moses trembled with fear and did not dare to look. Then the Lord said to him, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. I have indeed seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their groaning and have come down to set them free. Now come, I will send you back to Egypt." This is the same Moses they had rejected with the words, "Who made you ruler and judge?" He was sent to be their ruler and deliverer by God himself through the angel who appeared to him in the bush. He led them out of Egypt and performed wonders and signs in Egypt, at the Red Sea, and for 40 years in the wilderness. This is the Moses who told the Israelites, "God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your own people." He was in the assembly in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai and with our ancestors, and he received living words to pass on to us. But our ancestors refused to obey him. Instead, they rejected him and in their hearts turned back to Egypt. They told Aaron, "Make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who led us out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." This is when Moses was on the mountain receiving God's 10 commandments. "As for this fellow Moses who led us out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." That was the time they made an idol in the form of a calf. They brought sacrifices to it and reveled in what their own hands had made. But God turned away from them and gave them over to the worship of the sun, moon, and stars. This agrees with what is written in the book of the prophets. "Did you bring me sacrifices and offerings 40 years in the wilderness, people of Israel? You have taken up the tabernacle of Molech and the star of your god Rephan, the idols you made to worship. Therefore, I will send you into exile beyond Babylon." Our ancestors had the tabernacle of the covenant law with them in the wilderness. It had been made as God directed Moses according to the pattern he had seen. After receiving the tabernacle, our ancestors under Joshua brought it with them when they took the land from the nations God drove out before them. It remained in the land until the time of David, who enjoyed God's favor and asked that he might provide a dwelling place for the God of Jacob. But it was Solomon who built a house for him. However, the Most High does not live in houses, made by human hands. As the prophet says, "Heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build for me, says the Lord? Or where will my resting place be? Has not my hand made all these things? You stiff-necked people, your hearts and ears are still uncircumcised. You are just like your ancestors." I'm going to break for a bit. You can see he is referred back to the original covenant. And so there's a defining point here where he's saying you're not even part of the original plan of God. You've tried to withdraw yourself from something that won't be withdrawn from. You stiff-necked people, your hearts and ears are still uncircumcised. You are just like your ancestors. You always resist the Holy Spirit. Was there ever a prophet your ancestors did not persecute? They even killed those who predicted the coming of the righteous one. And now you have betrayed and murdered him. You have received the law that was given through angels, but have not obeyed it. That's the end of his speech. Powerful stuff at the end. Here's where the beginning, middle, end points are, which I've described through the middle, through the telling of it. The beginning is up to circumcision as a defining sign of a covenant, and the official forming of that community by his mention of the 12 patriarchs. And it seems that people were paying attention through that part of the story. The middle part of the main history, where he shows that the people are consistently not paying attention to God or living the life he gave them, and runs up to their rejection of Jesus at the end of the speech. There's something important there about him bringing forth again this, your hearts and ears are not circumcised, your listening and your vision and your sense of identity have refused to take on being a part of God's community. The ending is what people choose to do after that. And that's where we in this room fit into this community of God's people. I'm going to depart from Stephen's speech for a bit to tell another story. It has a beginning and a middle and an end. It's about one person, but it mirrors something of listening, of not listening, of paying attention. It's the story of Ted Mayo, who was a member of the congregation here for years, and before that ran the AA meetings and did the Soul Cafe breakfast even longer. Ted was born in the UK into a life of turmoil. He was in trouble with the law early in life. He served time in juvenile detention, a very rough experience in those days. When he was about 15, one of the officers in the place, who had a reputation of sexual abuse of the boys, tried to abuse Ted. Ted swung his fist and fought him off. And for that, he was charged with assault and transferred to adult jail to serve out his time. Somehow, after his release, he managed to join the military. He became a paratrooper and saw action with the British forces in the political mess that was Cyprus in the 1950s and 60s. One day he was in the back of a troop truck as they drove into a recently liberated village. Somebody in the crowd threw something at the soldiers, and Ted immediately turned and shot at whoever had thrown it. It turned out he'd killed a child about 10 who'd thrown an orange to the soldiers as a sign of thanks. And this is where the beginning part of Ted's story ends. His life is defined by it. It was defined early by his environment of one of suffering and of violence. And in this one terrible moment, he's confirmed that definition by proving that he was himself as bad as anything that had ever happened to him. There was no way back from this defining experience. And now the middle part of his story continues. Ted left the military and he went to Africa, where he found a life as a mercenary. These days, such soldiers are called private security contractors. Ted worked to protect the interests of oil and mining companies as they moved into the rich territories of many African nations. It was plunder and pillage. After time in Africa, he found himself in Australia, and he became known as a drunken vagrant living under the trees in city parks in Sydney. He was known by police, by Salvation Army support workers, and by the Sydney media, who would go and get a photo of Ted when they were doing an article on vagrancy or homelessness. He was the bad example. He was there for years, sometimes being picked up by police or Salvation Army to dry out before going back into the streets. One day, the Salvation Army found him unconscious. They got him to hospital, and it seemed he was close to death. He had poisoned himself with alcohol and methylated spirits for so long that his organs were shutting down and he had lost his eyesight. They had him in hospital for months, and his recovery was very slow. He needed rehab to learn to walk and talk again. His sight gradually returned, and at some point he was released. Over the course of years, he improved and took up a position working with the Salvation Army inner city hostel, working with men and women whose lives were like his own. He gave up drinking and became an AA leader. When I moved to Newcastle in 2008, I came across Ted in that room. There was his private kingdom down in Denison Street. Some of you will remember it. You didn't go into Ted's kingdom without an invitation, did you? Well, you didn't need an invitation, but you got the look. He was prepared to acknowledge some higher power in the AA model, but refused to have anything to do with the church that hosted his meetings. It's a bit like the people of Israel that Stephen talks about. They're prepared to acknowledge the existence of God, but not to go along with what God wanted in their life. I became friends with Ted, and I found him to the most grumpy guy I knew, but also Steve tells the story. He's not here today. I'll get him to tell it. No, I wouldn't. Steve came to help with the Saturday breakfast one time that Ted was sort of in charge of, and he walked in and he said, "I'm here to help. Where would you like me? What would you like me to do?" And he said, "Well, the first thing, get out of the kitchen." that was Ted. He was the most grumpy guy I knew, but he was also perceptive about assessing the motivations of the people who came to AA. I would take my clients to him after the AA meeting so I could introduce him personally. And he'd get them into conversation for a bit, and then he'd get back to me a day or so later about whether I should expect real response from them or not. Ted could do an assessment in a conversation with people and their motivation to change, or their motivation, they just wanted to go back to where their life was comfortable. I learned to see below the bluster, and I started to understand his story. And underneath the gruffness was extreme pain that would not go away. One day, I got up the courage to speak with him about the death of that child so long ago in Cyprus. A scary thing. There was a book published in those years called The 5 People You Meet in Heaven. I don't know if anybody even recognises the title. It's by a guy named Mitch Albom, one person. It's worth a read. It's a beautiful little book. It's about a Vietnam veteran, fiction, of course. It's about a Vietnam veteran who was haunted by the death of a child at his own hand in the Vietnam War. And it's a book about healing. I spoke about the book with Ted and I gave him a copy. He read it and returned it with thanks, but with no further conversation. But sometime later, he approached Kevin, who was pastoring the church back then, and said to Kevin, "Can I see you about making a confession?" And that is when the middle part of Ted's story ends and he goes into the ending. This was a defining moment. At last, Ted was ready to take notice of what God might do in his life. Ted had found the wisdom that he lacked. It was like the guy in the fairy tale I spoke about earlier. He'd found whatever he needed to face the dragon. Ted started coming to church. He was still grumpy and gruff, but he was softening. He would sometimes speak in church and ask me to play guitar for him as he sang his favourite hymn. Gone completely from my memory when I was writing my notes about what the hymn was, but I remember this: he had no sense of rhythm and no pitch. And playing a guitar for Ted, it was a different experience, I tell you. I would introduce us as Simon and Garfunkel. So you can tell who's who by who's got the hair, I used to say. Ted and I became close friends through it all. I would pick him up for church and we'd have conversations in the car about his life. He acknowledged that he had no idea why he was still alive after what his life had been like. But he would say that he wasn't living on borrowed time, but that his extended time was a gift from God that he didn't deserve. Ted died 18 months ago. I think he was 84, but I could never remember getting the nod. I visited him in hospital the evening before he died. And when I got home, I spoke with Chris Gaffney to let him know who would also visit him. Cam was there. I've got Cam out there in Zoom land. I expected Cam to be on the TV. It's great to see her in the flesh. Cam was there and visited me in the nursing home as well. And the next day, Chris was there with Ted and Ted's long-time friend, Susan, when they noticed that he'd just stopped breathing. He'd slipped quietly away in the company of loving friends when it so often seemed he would die a violent death in warfare or a lonely death under a tree in a Sydney park. He had asked that his ashes be scattered at sea, and so as COVID restrictions allowed in September 2020, Susan arranged for an ultralight to scatter his ashes out to sea off the Anzac Walkway above Bar Beach. A few of us gathered there to farewell our friend. The ultralight came up the coast from Pelican Airport. It gave a dip of a wing as we waved from the top of the car park there, and Ted's ashes drifted into the water. The ultralight turned back Pelican. And then the most extraordinary thing happened. Two of the Air Force's new F-35 fighter planes came down the coast from Williamtown. They flew low over the water, where Ted's ashes would still have been sinking, as if they knew what had happened. And then they sped off down south. Had we even thought about how to farewell a former paratrooper, we could not have come up with such a wonderful moment. Years later, it does this to me. We should take a moment to reflect on these two stories. One, the story of God's people, as told by Stephen. The other of just one person, Ted, a small blip amongst the rush of life on our planet. Both beginnings were characterized by trouble, enslavement for one and prison for the other. Both beginnings closed at a moment that defined them, a community for one and a killer for the other. The middle sections of the story show both running from the truth, running in the hope that they can live out a life of not paying attention. And for both of them, that was an active refusal to pay attention to what God wanted them or wanted to do in their lives. But it is in the ending that they differ. We don't know the ending of the story of people of God. It is still going and we're part of it. But we do know the ending of the story of Ted. And it's a good ending. Things got resolved. Ted gets deep healing from a fire that raged within him for so long. It's a story I like to tell because of the depth of human experience it encompasses. And so I want to encourage you to think about the story of your life. The decisions you make along the way can lead to a story that people will want to tell. What are the moments that have defined your life? Are they moments that the world has dumped upon you and that set you up for failure and disappointment? Are there moments where God has surprised you by taking you through tough times and you can look back and see his footprints beside your own? Have there been moments when you've suddenly paid attention to God and God has led you to something new, to some new wisdom, some new strength? Our theme today is about paying attention, and yet we so easily fall into daydreams instead. So to finish, I want to encourage you to think about the story of your life. The decisions you make along the way can lead to a story that the people of God will want to tell.